Okay. So we're I called this evening I called this evening's little get together Sartorial Splendor because in a few minutes we're going to be talking about the famous coat, the which on Broadway they called the Technicolor Dreamcoat. But before we do that, um, there is a verse before verse 3 where, hi, welcome. Uh, there is verse 2, the verse before the verse I put on the page that I just want to say two words about before we get into the very difficult verse 3 in our parsha. Uh, in verse 2, it says, Eila toldot Yaakov. These are the generations. In front of me, the Jewish Publication Society translation is, this is the line of Jacob. This is the offspring of Jacob. Sometimes many rabbis say these are the actions of Jacob. But what happens is, after that, it says, these are the generations. Hi, Gail. Great to see you. Welcome home. Okay, we'll talk later. You must be so jet lagged. I hope you. Okay. So it says these are the generations of Jacob, and immediately it says Yosef. So we're getting a hint to what's going to happen in our verse, in the verse before it. In other words, the main heir to the job or the role of Jacob in the world is going to be Yosef. And that's what we're being informed in the previous verse. And then there's something in the verse that's complicated, that he wasn't getting along with his brothers, and he was together with the children of the two shvachot, the maidservants who became the secondary wives, if you will, of Yaakov Avinu. But we're not going to get into that at all. But what's important about that previous verse that really prepares us for this verse is Eila toldot Yaakov. These are the generations. These are the bloodline of Jacob, and it just says Yosef. What's happened here is Yaakov, hi, welcome. Yaakov Avinu is no longer the main character in our story. The main character in a story is now going to be Yosef. Now, there are a lot of problems with why it's Yosef and it's not Ruvain or Yehuda or whatever. Some of those issues we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. But before we even get to our verse, we have to understand that Yaakov is no longer the main character of our narrative. The main character of our narrative is Yosef. It's not like Avraham. After he stops being a main character, he dies. And Yitzchak, the same thing. With Yaakov, he's no longer the main character, but he remains in the story. We're going to see many times that he pops up, and we're going to see times that God speaks to him, and we're going to see he has to make some decisions. The last Torah reading, the next to the last chapter in the book, is him giving blessings to everybody. He's not gone like Avraham disappeared when Yitzchak takes over, and Yitzchak disappears when Yaakov takes over. Well, right now, Yosef is taking over, but Yaakov doesn't disappear. And it's hard to understand why. In this week's Torah reading, it's going to come up really in next week's Torah reading, why it's important that Yaakov remains. So we're not going to handle it now, but we're seeing how Yisrael, Yaakov / Yisrael is handing over the reins to Yosef. And the actual handing over the reins was announced in verse 2, but is discussed in our verse, which is the third verse in the parsha. So now let's turn our attention to the verse at the top of the page that I gave you. Remember, verse 2 began, these are the generations of Jacob. Our verse begins, the Yisrael, not Yaakov. Yisrael, Israel, loved Joseph, Mikol Banav. He loved him more than any of his other sons. We're going to spend the first half of this evening discussing why he loved him. The reason given in the verse is because ki ben zikunim hu lo, because he is the child of his old age. That's a problem because Binyamin was a child of an even older age. And we're going to see there wasn't much age difference between Yosef and some of the other brothers. So we're going to have to understand that. And then the second issue, and he made for him an ornamented tunic. He made for him a coat of many colors. And that's what we're going to be talking about mostly on the second side of the sheet. But first we have to talk about what is this description of Yosef as the most beloved son. Okay, so let's start with Rashi. And a lot of the issues we're going to be discussing in the first half of tonight's discussion are in the Rashi. The son of his old age. Old age, according to Rashi, as he's quoting from the Aramaic translation, Bar Hakim in Unclus, because he was a wise son. It's not that he was a son when Yaakov was old. He's a son who was wise beyond his age, as if he were an older scholar, a sage, if you will. All that he had learned from Shem ve'ever, he taught to him. So in other words, according to the Midrash, on his way to Lavan's house, when he was running away from Esav and he goes there to get a wife, on the way, there's a Midrash that says he stopped for 14 years in the yeshiva of Shem ve'ever. Shem, the son of Noach, was still alive, according to the genealogies. It's sort of hard to believe, and his grandson, great-grandson, Aver, ran a yeshiva that, according to tradition, was in Tzfat. You can go to Tzfat and visit a cave. There's a Beit Knesset inside this cave, and the claim is that this was the yeshiva of Shem ve'ever. So Yaakov learned all sorts of mystical things from them, and he only taught that material to Yosef. Another explanation of Ben Zikunim, not that he was the son of his old age, but his facial features were similar to his. When Yaakov looked at Yosef, he saw the spitting image of himself when he was younger, and that endeared him to Yaakov. Then we're going to do this quickly because we're going to talk about the coat later. Then Rashi goes into the coat and he says, Karpas, that it had to do with when it says Ketonet Pasim, it was really Karpar. It was fine linen and blue, okay? And it's a special garment, like one that's later mentioned in the book of Samuel, okay? So we're going to come to the business with the coat a little bit later. So let's go on to the Ibn Ezra, please. So the Ibn Ezra says he loved him because he was the son of his old age. This is to be taken literally, not like Rashi. Rashi says, don't take it literally. It meant he's the wisest of the sons, and he was wise because Yaakov taught him. He was the repository of Yaakov's Torah. But the Ibn Ezra says take it literally. since Yosef was born to Jacob when the latter was 91 years old, making him older than all of the sons except for Benjamin. However, Binyamin, his brother, is referred to in 2 weeks. He's referred to as a child of his old age. What's interesting about the two verses is here when it says Ben Zekunim, Onkelos translated into Aramaic as Ben Hakim, a smart son. Over there, he really keeps it. Binyamin is really called a son of his old age. So Ibn Ezra says it, but it doesn't fit in all that well. It makes it a little bit hard, because why would he love him more than Binyamin? Okay, we're going to see something about that in a minute in the Chizkuni. We're going to skip the Sforno for the time being. We'll come back to him. The Chizkuni, the fourth commentary on the page, if you were to argue that Binyamin had been born when he was still older, you'd be right. Binyamin caused his father to be reminded that his existence brought about his beloved Rachel's death, something which prevented him from loving him as much. It's a very sad comment. When he looked at Binyamin, all he could think about was the fact that Rachel, whom he loved so very much, died in childbirth. It's just such a tragic idea. And on his deathbed, when he calls Yosef in, the first things he tells him is he can still remember Rachel. It's very sad, number one, but it's also fascinating that all of the great love stories in history, I mean, not to compare Torah to Shakespeare, but all of the great love stories in history are tragedies. Even Shir HaShirim, which is the great love story between God and the Jewish nation, ends up is really a tragedy, because at the end of this 8-chapter poem, the lovers don't get together. We find ourselves, wandering off without coming into the home of God. So it's really sad, tragic that the great love stories in history, and the love for Yaakov for Rachel is one of the greatest love stories in all of recorded history, are just tragedies. And so he couldn't look at Binyamin without reminding himself of that. So therefore, he loved his next to the youngest child the most, and that's Yosef. The Netziv, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, writing in the 1880s, 1890s, writes about this verse. And Yisrael loved, doesn't say Jacob loved, teaching us that his love was because he perceived in him spiritual qualities worthy of love. Yaakov is the physical power of this individual. Yisrael is his spiritual power. The love that he has for Yosef is on a spiritual level, not a physical level. So even though the previous verse talked about Yaakov, this verse talks about Yisrael. That his love was because he perceived spiritual qualities worthy of love, as it is written, more than all his sons, not more than all his brothers, as in the following verse. In the following verse, they talk about the brothers. Here they're the sons. This teaches that although Jacob loved him primarily because of superior qualities, still there was an additional reason. Joseph's natural disposition resembled Jacob's own more than that of the other sons. Whether he saw his physical form in him, like Rashi brought down, or he saw in him his own attributes, it doesn't make that much difference. But I think here he's talking more about his behavior patterns and his skill set and his intelligence. He saw himself. He saw himself in Yosef. It is the nature of children to resemble their father. As our sages said, a father merits through his son. And as the rabbinic expression goes, a child is the leg of his father. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. You're the spitting image of your father. We know that many times there are things about the sons that remind us about the father, and they do carry on certain attributes. Sometimes it has to do with physical form. Sometimes it has to do with behavior or intelligence. In this respect, Joseph excelled. He loved Joseph the most because Yosef, was the most like him. Is that true? I don't know. It perhaps is true, but he felt it to be true, and that's all that counts. He saw himself in Yosef. But in other spiritual qualities, Jacob may have known that amongst his sons, some surpassed him. In other words, there were certain people that had, amongst the brothers, who had really powerful character traits. We're going to see that mostly in Yehuda next week, and we're going to talk about Yehuda next week, that he eventually becomes the king of the Jewish people through King David, who his descendant. But the others of the brothers did have very wonderful character traits, which will be seen in the blessings in chapter 49. Thus the verse explains, for he was the son of his old age. This means that Jacob loved to make use of Joseph. This, and I actually like this interpretation very, very much. Just as an elderly person selects one son to attend him, choosing the one whose nature most closely resembles his own, even if others are greater in stature, what happens is he really sees in Yosef something that he wants Yosef to be with him all the time. He becomes his attendant. That's a fascinating phenomenon. And the first time I remember seeing this, I think was with Reb Scheinberg, although there are many cases of it that go around. But I remember going to ask a question of Reb Scheinberg in the 90s, Reb Scheinberg, Oliver Shalom, of blessed memory. He lived deep into his 90s. But I remember I saw him in the 80s, and I just went in to see him. Then I went back to see him for something in the 90s, and there was a grandson with him who was just with him. And that same grandson was with him like most of the time. He became his secretary, companion, and later, the last time I saw him, which was in the early 2000s, soon before he passed, we really couldn't understand. I was with a group actually seeing him. We really couldn't understand what Reb Scheinberg Zatzal was saying. So the grandson was putting his ear near his grandfather's lips and was telling us. And so this idea that someone, a son or a grandson or someone from the family, it could be a nephew, is there with a great person is something we see in our generation. We saw this with Rav Kadori toward the end of his life. He had grandsons again that were with him. Rabbi Yosef, who had hundreds of living descendants. When he died, the story is he had 960 living descendants at the funeral. That's amazing. Almost 1,000. He had a rotation with Rav Kadori, Rav Scheinberg, and many others. It was one person who did it most of the time, but Rabbi Yosef had a rotation of grandsons and great-grandsons that would come to be with him. A few days before Rabbi Yosef died, a baby was born that was the sixth generation, great-grandson. Amazing. Just absolutely remarkable. I mean, he had 12 children and lived to be 104, 106 maybe. But anyways, he lived to be into over 100. And so, I mean, just multiplies. Absolutely remarkable. But similarly, in a smaller context, Yaakov also had 12 children, and we see that Yosef becomes his attendant. Later in life, at the end, the Ephraim and Manasseh, the grandchildren, take over. When Yosef is the head of Egypt and he can't take care of his father, he sent variously, mostly Ephraim, but Manasseh as well, mostly Ephraim, to take care of Yaakov at the end. This is because of Jacob's attribute of kindness and love of peace, which was a defining trait in the ways of the world. And he saw this in Yosef. So it's Yosef that takes care of him. If you could go to the back of the page for just 1 minute, Rabbi Nachman, if you can look at the back side, please. It says, Rabbi Nachman says that he was the son of his Zikunim. He has a totally different interpretation. Yisrael loved him greatly because Yosef desired to show compassion for everybody. That the meaning for Yosef was the son of Zikunim, Zakein, elder, denotes the trait of compassion, chesed. As in the midrashic description of Hashem at Sinai was a Zakein full of chesed. So that's why Yosef was the one who was closest to Yaakov. He was just a person of kindness. And it was that kindness that drew him closer and closer to Yaakov. And that's why Yaakov really leaned on him. And that's why when he disappeared, it was such a tragedy for Yaakov that he said he would never recover from this. I mean, it's a terrible thing to lose children, but people do, not everyone, but many people do recover from the shock. But Yaakov said, and it was true, he never recovered from the shock of losing Yosef, and that continued for 22 years while he was missing. Okay, bottom of the first page, the Kli Yakar. And the Kli Yakar is going to be the transition into discussing his role in the family, that Yaakov loved him, to the second stage, which is he gave him the coat of many colors. He gave him the ketonet pasim. So this will be the transition. Although it said, and he was a youth with the sons of Bilhah, he hung out with, which is, before, in the previous verse he said, meaning he behaved in youthful ways like them. Ooh, he was a youth with the sons of Bilhah. So that's when he hung out with his brothers or half-brothers, he acted young. Jacob nevertheless loved him because when Joseph was with him, he conducted himself like an elder. I like this idea. And I'd like to think when I was teaching that I tried to emulate this idea, whether it's, if I taught middle school or high school, or I taught gap year students in college, or I did adult education, I think that I tried to relate to every audience based upon who they were. And I think we see that that's what the Kli Yakar is saying about Yosef. And it's important, to act appropriately for the age group which you are addressing, or which you are, in contact with, which you are dealing with. Because when Jacob was with him, he conducted himself like an elder. So it says he was a son of old age to him. Ben Zukunim hu lo. He acted like Yaakov when he was in Yaakov's presence, but he acted like the sons of Bilhah when he was hanging around with his half-brothers. This means specifically to Jacob Yaakov, not his brothers. Perhaps Yosef did not deviate from those around him, and he knew how to conduct himself among both young and old. Thus, he was a son of old age to him, to Yaakov. He calibrated his behavior based upon who he was interacting with. I think all of us try to do this. Sometimes we're more successful, sometimes we're less successful. We do when with our grandchildren try to relate to them at some way on their level as best we can. But it's just a fascinating idea that that's how the Kli Yakar sees that extra word in the verse, lo, to him. Some say, and this is an expansion of an idea we heard mentioned quickly in Rashi, some say that everything Jacob learned from Shem and Aver, from the descendants of Noah, he transmitted to Joseph, and only to Joseph. Only Yosef received these special lectures, these private lessons about the secrets that he learned for Shem V'Aver. And according to especially mysticism, this midrash is talking about receiving all sorts of secret stuff from Shem V'Aver, that came from Noah. And Noah knew Adam Arishon, so he was in direct contact with secrets from the beginning of humanity. Is the way the midrash and the Kabbalah sees it. Why did he not transmit this to all his sons? Why? I mean, you'd think he could have a Tuesday class on the teachings of Shem and Aver. Why was it only Yosef who got it? Because his other sons despised wisdom and did not come to Jacob to hear from him. That's a strong word, despise. Soneh was the Hebrew. I'd like to think that they were more nonchalant about it, bored with it. We know. I mean, all of us know when we want to talk to children and grandchildren about stories from our past, or we want to share ideas with them. Some of them are really into it, and others just roll their eyes and say Abba or Sabazadi. No, we don't want to hear this. Spare me those stories, please. But some of them, I just want to hear it all. It's just fascinating. It's based more on their personality than on ours. But the other kids, the other brothers, were not interested. That's the real reason it went to Yosef and Yosef alone. But Yosef was Ben Zikunim, son of his old age to him, meaning, backside, he turned to Yaakov to hear what he had learned from Shem Aver. Look, my relationship to this idea is between me and my sister. We were a family of only 2 kids. And, I used to love to hear my father's stories, and my sister was less interested in them. So I don't know whether it had to do with, gender issues or it was personality issues, but I loved hearing, stories about my father when he was in the service in World War II, about sports or whatever. And I just, some people are more interested and some people less interested. So because he was pumping Yaakov for information about Shem V'Aver, so Yaakov loved him. It's not a mystery according to Kli Yakar. The Midrash says, and Rashi had said this also, that Yosef's facial appearance remembered Yaakov's. One's wisdom illuminates his face. So in other words, he also felt the kinship because there was this like looking in a mirror or looking in, an old mirror from days gone by. And there is the Gemara, which says, great is study, for it leads to action. It's wonderful to study material, but eventually we want it to affect your behavior patterns. The verse mentions Joseph's perfection when it says he was tending the flock with his brothers to exclude all forms of forbidden shepherding. There's a famous Rashi and Midrash in Shmot about Moshe Rabbeinu, that it says when he was tending the flocks of his father-in-law, Yitro, he took him way deep into the desert. And of course, that's where he eventually bumps into the burning bush. But the Midrash says he took the sheep deep into the desert because if he pastured them nearby the town, he might be stealing grass from other shepherds. So he made sure that he went way out in the middle of nowhere where clearly the grass belonged to nobody. So to a certain extent, the Kli Yakar is applying that lesson that we talk about by Moshe, who was also a shepherd. Most of our great leaders were shepherds. We're applying that lesson from Moshe Rabbeinu to Yosef. And so Jacob loved him because he was a bar hakim. And here we have son of wisdom, which is the exact expression that was used by Onkelos in the Aramaic translation of the verse. So it's not that he was a son of old age, he was a son of wisdom. So we've got a number of explanations for what it means to be the son of his old age. It could be that he was really the son of his old age, and he couldn't give this love to Binyamin because Binyamin was the cause of his beloved Rachel's death. Or it could be Ben Zekunim had to do with certain character traits, either great intelligence or great chesed, kindness. All of them are nice, but I think it has to do with he loved him because he felt a greater kinship to him than to any other of the 12 sons. Okay, now we are shifting, and from here till the end of the of our evening's activity, we're going to be talking about the coat, the Ketonet Pasim, and he made for him a coat. How do you translate the coat? So the translation over here is a ornamented tunic, but we're going to see other translations for this, for what Ketonet Pasim. Some people say it was a long coat, but we'll see a couple of explanations. When does he give him the coat? This was after Reuven had disturbed his father's bed and lost the birthright to Yosef. What is this? Last week, we read that Rachel dies, and Yaakov goes into a deep depression, and during this time, Reuven goes into the tent of where Rachel had lived, and he does something. We're not sure what he does. There are some people that they said he did something nasty and wrong. Other people say, no. He was moving his mother's things into Rachel's tent so that Leah could take the place of Rachel. Whether he did something prohibited or he did something that was just overstepping some social boundaries, in any case, Yaakov is horrified because no one is going to ever replace in either his tent or his affection, his heart, Rachel. So what happens is, when Reuven disturbed his father's bed, he lost the birthright. Yaakov said, I am not making him my successor. That's what Yaakov decides. And so who's it going to be? So at this point, it's Yosef. When Yosef is missing, it seems like the one who's in charge is Yehuda. And like I said, we're going to talk about that next week. But in the long run, it's Yosef who is in Yaakov's thinking, the heir. And then it goes on to say, this coat was for the service of the firstborn. What did it mean before the building of the Mishkan, before we got the Torah? What was the job of the firstborn, of the Bechor, that Yaakov bought with a bowl of red soup from Esav? What was it? It was the job to do the divine service, bring sacrifices, lead communal services for the family. There were no Kohanim in Judaism until the giving of the Torah. So the Kohen was the firstborn, the Bechor. So what happened was he gives him this coat to say that it's like the priestly garments. He is the Bechor for the family. Perhaps this is why it says, for he was the son of his old age. He's saying, it's not Yaakov's old age, it's Yosef's old age. Yosef was old before his time. He was mature beyond his years, and therefore he viewed him as the Bechor. He behaved like the oldest son, and therefore he gave him the sign of being the Kohen. We're going to return to this idea a couple of times. He was not the eldest, and this is hinted at by the verse, shall you indeed reign over us, which the brothers say to him in 2 more verses, because the firstborn would take double, and kingship would belong to him. The great honors go to the firstborn. But Yosef has the dreams, and in the dreams it says, I'm going to be in charge. And then they turned to him and they said, are you indeed going to reign over us? But at the end, when Yaakov starts to give the blessings before he passes, in the next to the last chapter of the book of Genesis, chapter 49, Reuven, you are my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength. And that's referring to kingship. So he kept the door open for Reuven to get it, but he doesn't. Kingship goes to, although it did go to Binyamin with Shaul for just one king, but the permanent kingship goes to Yehuda. And we're going to see why next week. Now, there's the right of Yehuda to be the king is something we'll discuss, please God, next week. Rav Yaakov Mecklenburg, when he's talking about the coat, he says, he adds something to this idea that the Kli Yakar said. The coat served as a sign that he would be the leader. So far, same idea. For once his father recognized that he was of greater stature than his brothers, he wanted his clothing to reflect a level above theirs. In those days, garments were arranged according to a person's rank. For example, in Rome, only senators could wear tunics that had purple woven into the tunic, woven into the toga, if you will. So there were certain signs of leadership that were in the clothing that they wore. Today, it's not like this. It's like you go into many offices and you can't tell who the boss is because he might be, in jeans and a t-shirt. I mean, it's not like it used to be, but historically the boss looked like the boss. And that's how Rabbi Yaakov Mecklenburg is saying. Therefore, Pharaoh clothed Joseph in fine linen garments in next week's Torah reading because of his elevated status. It's not that the clothes make the man, it's that the man gets the best clothes if he's in the best position. And the Malbim just adds to that idea. He translates it a long, colorful cloak. Some people say the word pas is a reference to the soles of one's feet can be called a pas, which means like a flat section. So the garment went all the way down to his feet. It was a very long garment, which was unusual in those days because they didn't have pants, so they needed to be able to move. But a person who's like doing, more intellectual endeavors and isn't so physical has this coat that goes to the floor. They were dressed like shepherds. The Malbim goes, but because Yosef was his father's attendant, he was required to dress in a dignified manner. And this brings up one more idea that we're going to see in Steinsaltz, that one of the reasons that he loved him was because he was his attendant. he watched over, and we mentioned that before, but Steinsaltz is going to mention it again. So now he's got this beautiful coat, and he has the beautiful coat because he has a special role in the family. And you dress according to your status in whatever misgeret, whatever framework you find yourself. And Steinsaltz is going to comment on that as well. Yisrael loved Yosef more than all his sons because he was a son of his old age. Benjamin was even younger and also a son of beloved Rachel, but his personality was less prominent. So he doesn't say what we saw before, that he couldn't look at Binyamin because it reminded him of his beloved Rachel. He says just he didn't have the right personality. So Yaakov favored Yosef due to his outstanding personality. Additionally, Yosef resembled Rachel. Before we said he loved him because he looked like him. Now, Rav Steinsaltz Oliver Shalom is saying, he loved Yosef because he looked like Rachel, who had recently died. This verse describes Joseph as being of fine form and fair appearance, like his mother. Yosef is the only male to be described in such terms by the Torah. This expression, Yefat Toar, of beautiful form, the only male in Chumash who ever gets that title, gets that description, is Yosef, which probably means he was the most beautiful male in the text. And how was he so beautiful? Because he looked like Rachel. He looked like Rachel, who was very beautiful. Perhaps Yosef's features reminded Jacob of Rachel. One can imagine that Yosef was preferred because of his son's problematic behavior. What was the son's problematic? Reuven defiled the family, and Shimon and Levi's action in Shechem were met with Jacob's disapproval. A lot of the brothers did bad stuff, and Yosef didn't. So people got passed over because of the way they behaved. Before we do the Tiferet Shlomo, please go back to the front of the page. I want to take a look at the Sforno, which I had skipped when we were going through the first page. And now he's talking about the coat. So I put it in the wrong place. My bad. Solo Ketonet Pasim, he made him a striped coat or a coat of many colors or a coat with stripes as a visible sign that Yosef was intended to become the leader of the brothers. The use of distinctive clothing to symbolize stature is found in Isaiah. It's found in other places too. I will dress him in your tunic. Okay? So we see it's in the Torah, but it was in life in the ancient world, and we see other places. Even Yosef himself gets more clothing, and a special cloak is put on Shaul when he becomes king. It's not unusual. That authority is transferred to the one wearing the appropriate garments. Baba Kama 11 also confirms that authority is signaled by the attire worn by people possessing it. There's just one more idea about the love and the coat that we didn't mention, and that is that some people say that Yosef was chosen to, as we said before, to like take care of the father. He was with him all the time, and the coat represented the person who's like the major domo, the head of the house in that sense. Okay. And now we're going to leave the world of pshat and drush, of literal and midrashic, and we're going to enter sort of a little bit of a Kabbalistic realm with the Tiferet Shlomo, Reb Shlomo of Radomsk, writing at the beginning of the 20th century. The Midrash says that Yaakov made 4 garments for Yosef. Why 4 garments? Because that's what the Kohanim wore. A regular Kohen wore 4 garments. The Kohen Gadol wore 8. So we're not talking about that. But he was wearing 4 garments because it's not that he gave him responsibility in the household or that he watched over Yaakov. He was the Kohen. And a Kohen wears 4 garments. For Joseph was the aspect of Yesod, foundation. On Sukkot, as you know, we have the 7 ushpizin that come in, and each one of the ushpizin has an attribute that describes their behavior. Avraham is chesed. Yitzchak is gevura. Yaakov is tiferet. And Yosef is Yesod. And we say that Yesod represents tzaddik, Yesod olam. The righteous person is the foundation of the world. And Yosef is called, he's the only person in Tanakh who's called Hatzadik. Yosef Hatzadik. And so he wears 4 garments because he represents, as the Kohen, the 4 emanations, the 4 ways in which we receive messages, bounty, blessing from Hashem, and those are called Atzilut. Atzilut means it's like mystical emanations. It's somehow, that magical, mystical emanations that come out. The second level is called Bria, creation, Yesh Me'ayin. There was nothing there, and poof, now there is. Yetzira is taking things, and Yetzira is more like chemistry. Okay, you take, you take the tea bag and you put it in the tea, and now I've got tea in the air. It's no longer water, and it tastes different. It looks different. That's Yitzira. And then Asiya is just putting things together, like hammering a nail into a board. You can still see the nail and you can still see the board, but they're now together. So those are the 4 levels: the 2 magical, mystical ones, and then the 2 more physical ones. Okay, 4 garments, Kohen, but also the 4 ways in which God communicates or gives bounty to this world, because Yaakov and Yosef were the Yesod, the foundation. The word all. Now look at the verse for just 1 second. It says, Yosef Yaakov Yisrael. Sorry, Ahav et Yosef mikol banav. He loved Joseph from all the sons. Ki ben zekunim hu lo mikol banav. Why does it have to say all? Mikol. Why couldn't you say mi banav, from his sons? He liked them from more than all the other than the sons. He was the favorite of the sons. Why all? Why an extra word? Because we believe it. We don't have extra words in the Torah. The word kol seems superfluous, but kol, the everything, hints at Yesod. That's the fundamental, the foundation of things, and everything gets built on that foundation. And God preserves the emanation through kol. All of the things that God brings down to the world, they remain with us through the concept of Yesod and kol. This was with Rebekah when she took the garments of Esau. This magical idea started with Rivka. How did it start with Rivka? Remember when Yaakov is going to steal the blessings, and he says, oh, he'll recognize me. He says, no, he won't recognize you because I'm going to put Esau's clothes on you, and I'm going to put fur, Liam fur on your arms. So he won't tell that you're not Esau. So what was so special about these garments? The garments, the clothing that Esau had, Nimrod had stolen from Adam Arishon. Nimrod, who was a grandson of Noah, he somehow stole them from Adam Arishon. When Adam and Chava leave the Garden of Eden, God gives them clothes. That special garment that God gave to Adam eventually goes to Nimrod. Esau figures out a way to steal it from Nimrod. And then Yaakov gets it through Rivka. And now he gives it to Yosef. So this garment that he got is really the first garment that ever existed, made by God. Now, his brothers were jealous of him because he's got something very special. Nothing makes people jealous like, like a sports car, right? Or a swimming pool. But in this case, a really amazing set of clothes, saying that they too were Yesod. Hey, I'm a tzaddik too. Why don't I get it? Hence the dreams, which they did not believe. God gave Yosef the dreams to tell the brothers that he deserved the coat. That's what Tiferet Shlomo, what the Rebbe is saying here. The dreams were to tell the brothers, I am greater than you. This was the tribe's flaw in selling Yosef. That's why they hated him so much that they kidnapped him and sold him into slavery, because they stripped his coat. Once the coat comes off of Yosef, bad stuff happens. The emanations descended to others. The coat was directing, as Yosef, the Kohen for the family, is directing all of the godly power coming into this world. But when the coat is stripped off of Yosef, he's no longer in charge of these powers. Where did those powers go? They descended to outsiders. It went to other people in the world, as was written when it was written later, and they sat down to eat bread, and their camels were carrying. They sat down to eat, and then these people come by with a caravan with camels. What were the camels schlepping? The camels were schlepping the blessings that came down from heaven, and they're schlepping them away from Joseph's brothers and the Jewish people down to Egypt, meaning that the emanations went down to Egypt. All of the power that we were supposed to have went down to Egypt when they took the coat off of him. And they took the coat off of him in the presence of these Egyptians. So it transferred all of this divine power to the caravan, which brought it to Egypt. And that's what made Egypt so successful. This explains why the Lord blessed the house of the Egyptian because of Yosef. Wherever Yosef went in Egypt, the blessings went with him from the coat. And it is written, Jacob's coat, savage beasts devoured Joseph. Wait a minute. Literally, this cannot be understood. Here's the problem of the Rebbe. He's a Hasidic Rebbe, Reb Shlomo of Radomsk. And as any Hasidic Rebbe will tell you, they never make mistakes. And so if the Rebbe never makes mistakes, how could Yaakov make a mistake? Yaakov says, Yosef's dead when he sees the coat. He can't. How could he say that Yosef's dead? He's a Rebbe. He's a tzaddik. He can't be wrong. So what? How could the tzaddik say a non-truth? But in truth, Joseph lived in Egypt. What was Yaakov saying? He wasn't wrong. Yaakov can't be wrong. According to this explanation above, it hints the 288 sparks, Nitzotzei Kedusha, the holy sparks that fell from heaven during creation, which in exile was scattered to the non-Jews. And this is why our father Yaakov was aggrieved. I must go down to my sons, meaning he would need to descend to some place dark and deep to extract the sparks, the emanations, and the sparks that had fallen. He didn't see the death of Yosef. He saw the displacement of the divine power. He knew that bad things were going to happen. And this ends up the taking of the coat and the bringing of Yosef down to Egypt. That's what causes the Jews to be in bondage in Egypt. The coat brought down divine power. When the coat is taken and Yosef is exiled, whatever good blessings had been coming to the Jews, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were wealthy, very rich. They even dug wells and they were successful. They had successful crops when nobody else did. But all of those blessings went down to Egypt, and that's why Egypt had food and no place else did. So what we're seeing here is two major ideas. I mean, there's a lot going on, but idea number one is the role of leader has slipped away from Yaakov and found its place in Yosef. Number two, the idea of the taking off the coat meant that the Jews in general were losing their power. And that power also goes with those camels down to Egypt. And this is the harbinger, the beginning of the 400 years of slavery in Egypt. And there are people that try to date the 400 years, not from when the Jews go down, but from when they sell Yosef into slavery. So we see a changing of the guard, and we see a harbinger of the next stories of the Jewish people, which are going to be the entire content of Sefer Shemot, of the next book in the Torah. And so what's happening in this one verse is really encapsulated the tremendous change, the generational change of the Jewish nation, and is unfortunately as well the harbinger of what is going to become the shibud, the bondage down in Egypt. It had been predicted, but it wasn't predicted it was going to be as tough as it ended up being, and it was so terrible for us because the way it begins is enmity between brothers. And brother against brother is the worst possible of all situations. Okay, thank you for joining this evening. And Gail, welcome home.
Welcome home, Gail.
And we'll talk soon. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.